The Spanish Civil War, which erupted in July 1936, was not only a domestic conflict, but also a testing ground for foreign powers seeking to advance their interests. Among the most significant outside actors was Nazi Germany, which created a special military formation known as the Condor Legion. Its deployment represented a secret but decisive intervention that went beyond mere aid to General Francisco Franco's nationalist forces. It became a laboratory for new tactics, technologies, and doctrines that would shape the coming World War. To understand why Germany committed itself so deeply to Spain, one must examine the wider geopolitical context, the internal crisis within Spain, and the ideological climate of 1930s Europe. The collapse of Spain into civil war followed years of political instability. The proclamation of the Second Republic in 1931 introduced reforms designed to modernize the country. Land redistribution, secularization, and military restructuring. These policies alienated powerful institutions, the church, landowners, and much of the officer corps. By 1936, the polarization had become extreme. The Popular Front government, composed of left-wing parties, won elections in February, while right-wing forces increasingly viewed the Republic as illegitimate. When elements of the Spanish military rose in rebellion on 17th of July 1936, the conflict escalated into full-scale civil war between nationalists and Republicans. For Adolf Hitler, the Spanish Civil War presented an opportunity on multiple levels. Politically, Germany's support for Franco could strengthen ties with another authoritarian regime and secure access to raw materials such as Spanish iron ore. Militarily, it provided an arena to test new aircraft, tanks, and tactics under combat conditions, without the constraints of international treaties. Ideologically, the conflict was framed as part of the struggle against communism, aligning with Hitler's domestic propaganda and foreign policy goals. Germany's intervention was officially denied in public, but carefully coordinated at the highest levels of the Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe. International conditions made such intervention possible. The Western democracies, Britain and France, adopted a policy of non-intervention, fearing that Spanish instability might spark a wider European war. This created a vacuum exploited by Germany and Italy on one side, and the Soviet Union on the other. The Soviets supported the Spanish Republic with arms, advisors, and volunteers, seeing the conflict as a front in the broader struggle against fascism. Germany's involvement through the Condor Legion thus mirrored Moscow's commitment, transforming the Spanish Civil War into a proxy contest within Europe's polarized ideological landscape. The creation of the Condor Legion was formalized in November 1936. Composed initially of around 5,000 men, it consisted of air, armored, and anti-aircraft units drawn from the Luftwaffe and the German Army. The Legion was placed under the command of General Hugo Sperle, with Colonel Wolfram von Richthofen, cousin of the famous First World War ace, as Chief of Staff and later commander. It was an independent unit, operating under German command while cooperating with Spanish nationalist forces. Its secrecy was partial. While many Europeans suspected or knew of German involvement, Berlin maintained the fiction that the force was composed of volunteers. The presence of the Condor Legion in Spain marked the first major deployment of the Luftwaffe outside Germany. Aircraft such as the Heinkel, She 111, Junkers Ju 52, and Messerschmitt Bf 19 were tested under combat conditions, providing invaluable data for German planners. The Legion also included ground units, such as a tank detachment equipped with Panzer light tanks, though these proved underpowered compared to Soviet-supplied T-26s fielded by the Republic. The emphasis remained on air power, reflecting the Luftwaffe's growing centrality in German military doctrine. From the Spanish perspective, the arrival of German forces provided both advantages and complications. For Franco and his allies, the Condor Legion brought modern aircraft, trained personnel, and a boost in morale at a time when nationalist forces were struggling to establish control. At the same time, it created a dependence on foreign aid that limited the autonomy of Spanish commanders. For Republican forces, German involvement meant confronting not only Spanish adversaries, but also some of the most advanced military technology of the era, complicating their defensive efforts. The decision to intervene in Spain was not universally popular in Germany. Some military leaders questioned the risk of escalation, fearing that open involvement might provoke Britain or France. Others worried about draining resources from Germany's rearmament program. Yet for Hitler, the benefits outweighed the risks. Spain offered a unique chance to refine blitzkrieg concepts, train pilots and officers, and demonstrate German resolve against communism, all without directly provoking the Western powers. Thus, the preconditions for the Condor Legion's role in Spain were set by the convergence of Spain's internal collapse, Germany's strategic ambitions, and the broader ideological conflict of the 1930s. The Legion's presence transformed the Spanish Civil War into both a testing ground for modern warfare and a rehearsal for the wider conflict that would erupt in Europe only 3 years later. The deployment of the Condor Legion to Spain began in late 1936, only months after the outbreak of the Spanish Civil War. Its initial arrival was shrouded in secrecy, reflecting both the political risks of intervention and the desire of German leaders to maintain plausible deniability. Yet, within weeks, the presence of German aircraft and personnel became evident on the battlefield, marking the start of a new phase in the conflict, where foreign intervention played a decisive role. The first German involvement was limited to air transport. Using Junkers Ju-52 aircraft, German crews helped ferry the Army of Africa, Franco's most effective force, from Spanish Morocco to the mainland in August and September 1936. This airlift was unprecedented in scale. Over 13,000 troops and 270 tons of equipment were transported across the Strait of Gibraltar in a matter of weeks. Without it, Franco's elite troops might have remained stranded, leaving the nationalist uprising fragmented. This operation convinced Hitler of the strategic value of greater German participation. By late 1936, the formal structure of the Condor Legion was established. The Legion's air component included bomber squadrons equipped with Heinkel-He 111s and Dornier Do 17s, fighter groups flying Messerschmitt, Bf-19s and Heinkel-He 51s, and reconnaissance units operating Heinkel-He 70s. Anti-aircraft artillery batteries and ground support units provided additional capabilities. In total, the force numbered around 5,000 men at its peak, rotating in and out of Spain on long tours of duty. Its chain of command reported directly to Berlin rather than to Spanish nationalist officers, ensuring that operations served both German and Spanish objectives. The nationalist leadership welcomed this influx of modern weaponry and trained personnel. Franco understood that German aid could tilt the balance of the war, especially in the air, where the Republic initially enjoyed superiority thanks to Soviet deliveries of fighters and bombers. Yet, cooperation was not without tension. German officers often pursued missions designed to test equipment or doctrines rather than support specific Spanish operational goals. For example, some bombing raids were selected less for their tactical value than for the opportunity they provided to evaluate aircraft performance under combat conditions. For the Republic, the sudden appearance of German squadrons dramatically altered the air war. Soviet-supplied Polikarpov, Ilyushin I-15 and Iowa-16 fighters, had allowed Republican pilots to contest the skies effectively in the early months. But the introduction of the Bf-109 provided the nationalists with an edge in speed and climb rate. This shift in air superiority had immediate consequences on the battlefield, enabling more effective ground support for advancing nationalist troops. The presence of the Condor Legion was also a test for German command structures. General Hugo Sperle, the initial commander, coordinated with Franco's staff but maintained operational independence. Colonel Wolfram von Richthofen, who later took command, emphasized close air-ground cooperation, experimenting with concentrated bombing before infantry assaults. These innovations foreshadowed methods that would later define the early German campaigns of the Second World War. German personnel were officially described as volunteers, yet their deployment was carefully managed. Most were regular members of the Luftwaffe or Wehrmacht, selected for both competence and loyalty. Their participation was framed in propaganda as a demonstration of solidarity with Spain against communism, But within military circles, it was understood as a rare chance for live-fire training. Dozens of future Luftwaffe leaders, including pilots who would become aces in World War II, gained their first combat experience in Spain. For the civilian population of Spain, the arrival of the Condor Legion soon became synonymous with intensified aerial warfare. German bombers targeted not only military positions, but also infrastructure, transport hubs, and in some cases, urban centers. Though justified by German commanders as efforts to disrupt Republican logistics, these raids often caused extensive civilian casualties. The population of Madrid, subjected to repeated bombing in late 1936 and early 1937, experienced firsthand the destructive capabilities of modern air power. The opening phase of Condor Legion operations thus marked a turning point in the Spanish Civil War. From an initially limited airlift mission, German involvement expanded into a comprehensive deployment of men, machines, and tactics. The Legion's arrival shifted the balance of power in the skies, introduced new dimensions of warfare to the conflict, and bound Spain's struggle to the larger contest of ideologies and military experiments that would soon engulf Europe. The stage was now set for increasingly ambitious operations that would test both the resilience of the Spanish Republic and the effectiveness of Germany's evolving military doctrine. The strategic goals behind the creation and deployment of the Condor Legion reflected both immediate concerns in Spain and long-term calculations in Berlin. For Hitler and the German High Command, the mission was never purely about ensuring Franco's victory. It was an experiment designed to serve multiple objectives, strengthening a potential ally, testing new weapons and doctrines, and sending a signal to Europe about Germany's growing military power. For Franco and the nationalist leadership, the Legion was a means of compensating for deficiencies in equipment, training, and mobility that had threatened to stall their campaign. On the Republican side, the presence of the Condor Legion was perceived as both a challenge and an opportunity. While it meant facing some of the most advanced military technology of the time, it also exposed the conflict as an international struggle, which could be used to rally foreign support. Germany's goals were threefold. First, the Spanish conflict offered an unparalleled chance to test the Luftwaffe in real conditions. Formed only in 1935, the Air Force lacked combat experience and sought opportunities to experiment with bomber tactics, fighter escort doctrines, and air-ground coordination. Spain provided a laboratory for evaluating new aircraft, such as the Heinkel HK-11, Dornier Do 17, and Messerschmitt Bf 109, as well as techniques for concentrated bombing and close air support. Second, Germany used the Condor Legion to gain political leverage over Franco. By providing indispensable assistance, Hitler aimed to secure access to Spanish resources and possibly naval bases in the Western Mediterranean, thereby extending Germany's strategic reach. Third, intervention allowed Berlin to confront Soviet influence indirectly, weakening a rival power without triggering a direct confrontation. For Franco, the strategic purpose of accepting German support was clear: survival and eventual victory. At the outset of the war, the nationalists lacked air transport, heavy artillery, and modern aircraft. The Legion's presence allowed Franco to move his best troops from Africa to the mainland, maintain pressure on Madrid, and gradually wear down Republican strongholds. In return, Franco was careful to avoid becoming a mere client of Berlin. He integrated German operations into his overall strategy while ensuring that ultimate political control remained in Spanish hands. His careful balancing act ensured that while the Condor Legion had operational autonomy, it did not dictate the trajectory of the entire campaign. Republican leaders, meanwhile, recognized the significance of the Condor Legion almost immediately. The superior performance of German aircraft forced the Republic to appeal for greater Soviet support. By late 1936, shipments of Polikarpov, I-15 and I-16 fighters, along with T-26 tanks and advisors, began to arrive from the USSR. The result was an indirect contest between German and Soviet military technologies, with Spain serving as the battleground. This confrontation shaped both sides' doctrines. The Luftwaffe refined its emphasis on speed and maneuverability in fighters, while Soviet tacticians developed methods for mass tank and air operations. Logistics played a central role in shaping the Legion's planning. German aircraft and personnel had to be transported across France and Italy, often under diplomatic cover, to reach Spanish bases. Supplies of fuel, spare parts, and ammunition were shipped through Italian ports or directly to nationalist-held Spanish harbors. Maintaining secrecy was difficult, but Berlin persisted in the fiction that the Legion was a force of volunteers. This allowed Germany to avoid direct violation of the non-intervention agreement, although the scale of its involvement was an open secret. The Legion's planning also involved propaganda considerations. German media portrayed the intervention as a noble effort to defend European civilization from Bolshevism, echoing Franco's framing of the war as a crusade. At the same time, the Luftwaffe leadership carefully monitored the results of operations, publishing technical reports and disseminating lessons learned to units back in Germany. Every sortie, bombing raid, and aerial engagement became data in an evolving doctrine that emphasized combined arms coordination and decisive strikes. One of the miscalculations on both sides concerned the anticipated duration of the conflict. German planners initially assumed that their intervention would accelerate a swift nationalist victory. Instead, the war dragged on for nearly 3 years, requiring extended deployments and additional resources. This prolonged involvement strained the Condor Legion, which rotated personnel and equipment to maintain operational effectiveness. For Franco, the extended conflict meant that, while German aid was invaluable, it came at the cost of increasing dependence on foreign powers. For the Republic, the war's length created both opportunities to mobilize support abroad and immense difficulties in sustaining morale and resources. Strategic planning also reflected competing priorities within the German leadership. The Luftwaffe sought maximum freedom to experiment, while the Foreign Ministry worried about provoking Britain and France. The Wehrmacht High Command, for its part, was interested in lessons for mechanized warfare, but questioned the emphasis on air power over land operations. These tensions shaped the nature of the Legion's deployments. Air dominance and aerial bombardment became its central focus, while ground operations were limited to smaller detachments. In sum, the goals and planning of the Condor Legion reveal its dual identity. It was both a tool of German strategic ambition and a critical lifeline for the Spanish nationalists. Its operations were meticulously designed to serve multiple agendas, military, political, and ideological, while adapting to the realities of a prolonged civil war. The consequences of these calculations would soon be tested in the first major engagements, where the Legion moved from preparation to action, directly confronting Republican forces in the skies and on the battlefield. The first major engagements involving the Condor Legion began in late 1936 and early 1937, when German units moved from transport and training roles into direct combat. These initial clashes revealed both the strengths and the weaknesses of the Legion's organization, while also shaping the broader course of the Spanish Civil War. They tested new technologies, altered the balance of power in the air, and introduced Spanish civilians to the realities of modern aerial bombardment. The earliest operations centered around Madrid, which had become the focal point of the war after nationalist advances brought them close to the capital by November 1936. Franco's forces attempted to seize the city in a direct assault, but determined Republican resistance and Soviet aid blunted the offensive. The Condor Legion was ordered to provide air support, initially with the Junkers Ju-52 bombers, escorted by Heinkel He-51 biplanes. These aircraft quickly revealed their limitations. The Ju-52s, designed as transports, were vulnerable to the faster Soviet-supplied Polikarpov, Il-15, and I-16 fighters, while the He-51s could not match the speed or maneuverability of their opponents. This imbalance forced rapid adaptation. In early 1937, the Luftwaffe introduced the Messerschmitt Bf 109 to Spain, initially in small numbers. The new fighter dramatically changed the air war. Faster, with a top speed of over 450 km/h, and equipped with modern armament, it outclassed most Republican aircraft. The arrival of the Bf 109 gave the nationalists, and by extension the Condor Legion, the ability to challenge Soviet fighters on more equal terms. Although numbers were limited, German pilots quickly began gaining experience in dogfights that foreshadowed tactics later employed in World War II. At the same time, the Legion began experimenting with new bombing tactics. Rather than dispersing efforts over wide areas, German commanders tested concentrated raids aimed at both military targets and urban centers. Madrid, already under siege, became one of the first European capitals to experience sustained aerial bombardment. The attacks targeted communications hubs, government buildings, and sometimes residential neighborhoods, causing significant civilian casualties. While German reports framed these operations as tests of precision and morale-breaking techniques, for Madrid's residents they represented a new form of warfare that blurred the line between battlefield and city. The Battle of Malaga in February 1937 was among the first campaigns where the Condor Legion played a decisive role. Nationalist forces, supported by Italian divisions and German air units, launched an offensive against the Republican-held city. The Legion provided air superiority, bombing Republican positions and strafing retreating columns. The collapse of Malaga was swift, with tens of thousands of civilians fleeing along the coastal road under repeated air and naval attacks. For the Germans, the operation demonstrated the value of coordinating air power with ground offensives, but it also drew international condemnation due to the heavy toll on non-combatants. The spring of 1937 brought the Condor Legion into one of the most infamous episodes of the Spanish Civil War, the bombing of Guernica. On 26 April, German Heinkel and Dornier bombers, supported by Italian aircraft, carried out a sustained raid on the Basque town during a nationalist offensive in the north. The attack destroyed much of the town center and killed hundreds of civilians, though exact figures remain debated, with estimates ranging from 200 to over 1,000. Militarily, the operation was intended to disrupt Republican logistics and block a key road junction. Politically, it became a symbol of the dangers of aerial warfare against civilians, immortalized in Pablo Picasso's painting Guernica. For the Condor Legion, Guernica was not unique. Similar raids occurred elsewhere, but it was the one that captured global attention, intensifying scrutiny of German involvement. Throughout these early clashes, the Condor Legion refined its operational doctrines. German commanders emphasized flexible use of fighter cover, rapid deployment of bombers, and close coordination with ground units. Wolfram von Richthofen in particular developed methods for concentrated bombing immediately preceding infantry or armored assaults, seeking to maximize shock and disruption. These innovations, though often imperfect in Spain, foreshadowed the techniques later employed in Poland in 1939 and France in 1940. On the Republican side, the first encounters with the Legion forced adaptation as well. Soviet pilots and advisors worked to improve coordination between fighters and bombers, while Republican anti-aircraft defenses grew more organized. The appearance of the Bf-109 spurred requests for newer Soviet models, though logistical and political obstacles limited their delivery. Meanwhile, international brigades fighting on the ground experienced firsthand the impact of German air power, reporting that nationalist advances were often preceded by devastating bombardments that disoriented defenders. For civilians, the first months of Condor Legion operations represented a transformation of war itself. Spanish towns and cities, previously shielded from direct conflict, became primary targets. Refugees fled in large numbers, food shortages worsened, and morale among the Republican population began to falter under repeated air raids. The psychological impact of these early bombings was immense, introducing fear and uncertainty that spread far beyond the immediate front lines. In these first engagements, the Condor Legion demonstrated both its growing capability and its experimental nature. Its aircraft, pilots, and doctrines were still in development, but Spain provided the proving ground. What began as support for Franco's war effort evolved into a testing campaign for Germany's emerging military machine. These early clashes revealed the future of warfare, fast-moving, mechanized, and, above all, marked by the devastating potential of air power. As the Spanish Civil War entered its second year, the Condor Legion expanded its operations in both scale and intensity. What had begun as limited support for Franco's nationalists now evolved into a more systematic campaign of experimentation and escalation. The spring and summer of 1937 witnessed some of the heaviest fighting in the north of Spain, where the Republic still controlled large territories in the Basque Country, Cantabria, and Asturias. For Germany, these offensives provided an opportunity to test doctrines of concentrated air-ground coordination, to evaluate logistical capacity during prolonged campaigns, and to measure the effectiveness of sustained aerial bombardment against entrenched defenses and civilian populations. The offensive in the north began with the Battle of Vizcaya in April 1937. Nationalist forces, with Condor Legion support, aimed to cut off the Basque Country from the rest of Republican Spain. German bombers conducted raids against Bilbao and surrounding towns, focusing on industrial targets such as steelworks and transport networks. Yet civilian areas inevitably suffered as well, demonstrating the difficulties of precision bombing in the 1930s. The raids inflicted both physical damage and psychological strain, compelling thousands of civilians to flee towards safer areas. Basque leaders appealed to Britain and France for humanitarian assistance, and foreign journalists reported extensively on the devastation, reinforcing international outrage following the earlier destruction of Guernica. The siege of Bilbao in June 1937 was a critical test of the Condor Legion's ability to support a sustained campaign. German aircraft flew constant sorties, bombing bridges, railways, and supply depots to strangle the city's resistance. Anti-aircraft defenses were gradually overwhelmed, and Republican pilots, though bolstered by Soviet aid, were unable to reverse nationalist air superiority. When Bilbao fell on 19th of June, the Condor Legion claimed credit for the collapse of the city's defenses, though ground operations by nationalist divisions and internal political divisions among Republicans also played key roles. For the Germans, the campaign confirmed the value of strategic bombing as a tool for weakening industrial and logistical capacity before an assault. At the same time, the prolonged campaign exposed weaknesses in German planning. The Condor Legion faced increasing difficulties in maintaining aircraft in the field. Spare parts had to be shipped across Europe, and mechanical failures became frequent. The hot, dusty conditions of Spain also revealed vulnerabilities in engines and airframes, leading to constant technical adjustments. Pilots and ground crews were forced to improvise maintenance solutions, providing valuable lessons for future conflicts, but also limiting operational tempo. The escalation of air operations was not confined to northern Spain. In central Spain, German bombers repeatedly targeted Madrid in 1937, aiming to weaken Republican morale and disrupt governance. These raids caused significant civilian casualties but failed to force a surrender. International opinion hardened against Germany, with British and French newspapers highlighting the human cost of indiscriminate bombing. Yet in Berlin, Luftwaffe leaders studied the results carefully, concluding that morale bombing alone was insufficient without a decisive military follow-up. This assessment would later shape their approach to the aerial campaigns of the Second World War. The summer of 1937 also saw the Condor Legion engage in major ground support operations during the Battle of Brunete, launched by Republican forces west of Madrid in July. The Republic committed over 8,000 troops, supported by Soviet tanks and aircraft, in an attempt to relieve pressure on the capital and regain initiative. The Condor Legion responded with concentrated bombing raids and relentless fighter patrols. German aircraft targeted supply columns, bridges, and troop concentrations, slowing the Republican advance. Despite early Republican gains, the combination of nationalist counterattacks and superior air support forced the withdrawal by late July. Casualties were heavy on both sides. Republican losses exceeded 25,000 men, while nationalists suffered around 17,000. For the Condor Legion, Brunete demonstrated the effectiveness of coordinated air-ground defense, though it also highlighted the limits of air power when facing determined offensives. Morale and psychological effects became increasingly important during this phase of the war. For nationalist troops, the presence of modern German aircraft boosted confidence, reinforcing the perception that they were fighting with advanced technology on their side. For Republican forces, the constant threat of Condor Legion bombers contributed to fatigue and demoralization, particularly among poorly equipped units. Civilians living near front lines or in major cities faced continuous anxiety, with shelters, blackouts, and evacuation becoming part of daily life. Contemporary accounts describe families fleeing at the sound of approaching aircraft, often unsure whether the target would be a railway, a factory, or their neighborhood. International reactions to the Legion's escalating role intensified. The Non-Intervention Committee, established by Britain and France, proved unable to enforce its own policies, as German and Italian intervention became increasingly visible. Soviet propaganda emphasized the role of the Condor Legion in atrocities such as Guernica and Bilbao, framing the war as a struggle between fascism and democracy. German propaganda, in contrast, portrayed the Legion as a force of discipline and order, defending Europe against Bolshevism. These competing narratives deepened the ideological polarization of the late 1930s. By late 1937, the Condor Legion had firmly established itself as a decisive factor in the Spanish Civil War. Its operations escalated the conflict, altered the balance of power in key theaters, and provided Berlin with invaluable lessons in logistics, technology, and strategy. Yet the campaigns also revealed the limits of air power as an independent war-winning tool. While cities could be bombed into submission and offensives blunted from the air, victory still required coordinated ground action and political cohesion. For both Germany and Spain, these lessons would prove crucial in the years to come, as the war ground on and the role of the Condor Legion deepened further. By 1938, the Condor Legion had reached the height of its involvement in the Spanish Civil War. What had begun as a limited experiment in 1936 had now developed into a mature, highly coordinated force integrated into major nationalist offensives. The Legion had gained valuable combat experience, refined its operational doctrine, and demonstrated the capacity of modern air power to shape the battlefield. Yet the year also exposed the limitations of German methods, the difficulties of sustaining long campaigns, and the human toll inflicted on both soldiers and civilians caught in the conflict. The first major campaign of 1938 was the Nationalist Offensive in Aragon, launched in March. Nationalist forces, reinforced with German and Italian support, sought to break through Republican defenses, split Republican territory in two, and cut the connection between Catalonia and the Central Republican Zone. The Condor Legion played a critical role. Its fighters established air superiority early in the campaign, outmatching the remaining Soviet-supplied aircraft flown by Republican pilots. German bombers concentrated on destroying bridges across the Ebro River, isolating Republican units, and preventing reinforcements from reaching the front. The offensive succeeded. Nationalist troops advanced rapidly, capturing towns such as Belchite, Caspe, and ultimately reaching the Mediterranean coast in April. For German commanders, the Aragon offensive demonstrated the effectiveness of concentrated bombing in support of mobile ground forces. Wolfram von Richthofen's staff documented how coordinated air-ground operations disrupted Republican communications and weakened defensive lines. The lessons of Aragon would later be incorporated into the Luftwaffe's doctrine of Schwerpunkt, or concentration of force, central to Blitzkrieg strategy. Yet the campaign also revealed strains. Aircraft suffered from wear after months of heavy use, pilots faced exhaustion, and supply chains remained vulnerable. The Luftwaffe leadership in Berlin recognized that extended campaigns demanded logistical infrastructure far beyond what had been planned at the start of the intervention. The Aragon campaign also intensified the suffering of civilians. Republican towns caught in the path of advancing nationalist forces were heavily bombed. Refugees fled by the tens of thousands, many targeted by strafing attacks along roads. Reports from international observers describe streams of displaced people, often families carrying only what they could, harassed from the air, while German commanders emphasized military justifications for these operations, arguing that roads carried reinforcements and supplies. The impact on civilian morale and international opinion was profound. The most significant campaign of 1938, however, was the Battle of the Ebro, fought from July to November. The Republic launched this offensive in a desperate attempt to regain initiative and prolong the war, concentrating nearly 8,000 troops, supported by artillery, tanks, and around 200 aircraft. Initially, Republican forces achieved surprise, crossing the Ebro River and pushing several kilometers into nationalist territory. But the Condor Legion, together with Italian and Spanish air units, responded with relentless bombing. German aircraft destroyed pontoon bridges and ferries, isolating Republican troops on the western bank. Continuous air raids targeted supply lines, ammunition depots, and troop concentrations. The Ebro became a grinding battle of attrition. Republican forces fought tenaciously, holding their bridgeheads for months despite overwhelming nationalist air superiority. Condor Legion bombers flew thousands of sorties, while Bf-109 fighters patrolled the skies, gradually wearing down Republican air resistance. By November, Republican forces were exhausted, having lost over 7,000 men in casualties, while nationalist losses amounted to around 3,000. The defeat left Catalonia exposed and effectively broke the Republic's ability to mount large-scale offensives. For the Condor Legion, the Ebro was both a triumph of sustained air dominance and a sobering lesson in the limits of air power to deliver rapid victory when facing determined resistance. Throughout 1938, German pilots and officers also refined tactical innovations that would later define the Luftwaffe. Dive bombing, tested with the Heinkel Hay 50, and early models of the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka, was practiced in Spain on a small scale. These experiments revealed the precision and psychological shock such attacks could deliver, influencing the Luftwaffe's decision to expand dive bomber production. Fighter pilots perfected techniques of formation, flying, particularly the finger four arrangement, which offered flexibility and mutual protection compared to earlier rigid formations. These methods, developed in Spain, would later dominate aerial combat in the Second World War. For nationalist troops on the ground, the Condor Legion provided more than just firepower. German reconnaissance aircraft delivered vital intelligence on enemy movements, allowing Franco's commanders to anticipate Republican maneuvers. Artillery spotting from the air increased the accuracy of bombardments. The presence of German anti-aircraft batteries also shielded nationalist concentrations from Soviet bombing attempts. This comprehensive integration of air and ground operations made the Legion indispensable to Franco's war effort. Yet the increasing reliance on German aid came with political implications. Franco carefully managed relations with his foreign backers, ensuring that Spanish sovereignty was not overshadowed by German or Italian ambitions. He limited the Legion's ability to act independently in certain sectors and avoided granting Berlin long-term economic or territorial concessions. For Germany, this restraint was frustrating, but the value of Spain as a testing ground outweighed immediate strategic gains. Meanwhile, Republican leaders faced mounting difficulties. Soviet aid, once critical, dwindled as Stalin shifted priorities towards securing alliances with Britain and France. The Republic relied increasingly on domestic mobilization and dwindling international brigades, but these could not compensate for the technological edge of the Condor Legion. Republican pilots and tank crews did their best with what remained, but morale declined as nationalist victories mounted. Civilians in Republican territory endured relentless bombing campaigns, food shortages, and dislocation, fueling a sense of despair. By the end of 1938, the Condor Legion had reached the peak of its influence in Spain. It had helped secure nationalist advances in Aragon, decisively contributed to the crushing of the Ebro offensive, and tested doctrines that would become central to German strategy in the next global conflict. Yet its operations also revealed critical realities. Air power could devastate, disrupt, and demoralize, but it could not win wars alone without coordinated ground offensives and political consolidation. Spain, for Germany, was both a success and a warning. The final year of the conflict would demonstrate how these lessons shaped the last stage of the Condor Legion's mission. By early 1939, the Condor Legion found itself in the final phase of its mission in Spain. The nationalists, bolstered by successive victories and increasingly confident in their dominance, prepared for the decisive campaigns that would bring the Civil War to an end. The Legion's task shifted from experimentation and demonstration to the systematic application of the tactics and technologies it had refined over the previous 2 years. Resistance remained, especially in Catalonia and central Spain, but the balance of power had tilted decisively in Franco's favor. The German presence was now aimed at consolidating gains, securing final victories, and extracting maximum operational lessons before withdrawal. The Catalonia offensive, launched in December 1938 and lasting until February 1939, represented the Legion's last great effort. Nationalist forces deployed nearly 34,000 troops against approximately 22,000 Republican defenders. The Condor Legion, though smaller than in earlier years due to rotations and wear, still provided modern aircraft and seasoned pilots. Its fighters quickly established dominance, as the Republican Air Force was by then reduced to a fraction of its former strength, with fewer than 150 operational aircraft. German bombers struck transportation hubs in Barcelona, Tarragona, and Girona, targeting bridges, railway lines, and supply depots to disrupt Republican mobility. The offensive advanced rapidly. Barcelona, the Republic's second-largest city and its political center in Catalonia, came under heavy bombardment in January 1939. German reports emphasized the effectiveness of concentrated raids against industrial and port facilities, but international observers highlighted the severe civilian casualties. The League of Nations debated the issue of aerial bombardment once again, but no concrete measures followed. For the Condor Legion, Barcelona's fall on 26 January was a demonstration of how sustained air support could complement overwhelming ground superiority. For civilians, it meant mass exodus. More than 400,000 refugees fled toward the French border, many bombed from the air during their flight. Inside Germany, the operational reports from Catalonia were carefully studied. The Luftwaffe noted how logistical choke points could paralyze enemy defenses, while fighter sweeps cleared the skies for bombers with increasing efficiency. Von Richthofen and his staff circulated detailed analyses to Luftwaffe headquarters, shaping plans for the role of air power in any future European conflict. Dive bombing experiments, reconnaissance methods, and coordination with armored columns were all codified into doctrines that would be put into practice in Poland only months later. For Republican defenders, the offensive was catastrophic. Despite determined resistance in towns such as Igualada and Manresa, they faced insurmountable disadvantages. Ammunition was scarce, food supplies dwindled, and morale crumbled under relentless bombing. Soviet aid had largely ceased as Moscow prioritized its diplomatic maneuvering in Europe. Republican commanders complained that German aircraft controlled the skies, limiting their ability to maneuver or counterattack. The disparity was stark. The Condor Legion maintained modern Bf-109 fighters and Heinkel He 105 bombers, while the Republic relied on aging Polikarpov fighters and overworked pilots with little rest. Following the fall of Catalonia, the Condor Legion's focus shifted towards central Spain. Madrid remained the symbolic heart of the Republic, but by early 1939 its situation was untenable. Surrounded, divided internally by political disputes, and suffering from shortages, the city's defense was more symbolic than strategic. The Condor Legion participated in preparatory raids, striking communication lines and Republican strongpoints. Yet its role was more limited than in earlier battles. By this stage, the Republic was collapsing, and the nationalists required less German assistance to secure victory. As operations wound down, the Legion adapted to a new role, consolidating its experience. Pilots were rotated back to Germany to disseminate lessons learned. Technical teams compiled data on aircraft performance under diverse conditions, comparing Spanish operations with pre-war theoretical models. Ground crews documented the challenges of maintaining supply lines over long distances, while commanders debated the relative merits of terror bombing versus tactical support. These reports created a body of knowledge that would shape Luftwaffe doctrine for years to come. For German personnel, the final months were a mixture of triumph and fatigue. Many had spent years in Spain, flying repeated sorties or maintaining aircraft in difficult conditions. While the Legion had gained prestige, its members had endured hardships, accidents, combat losses, and the strain of prolonged deployment. Estimates suggest that around 300 Legion members were killed in Spain, with hundreds more wounded or captured. For the nationalists, their contribution was invaluable, but for Germany, Spain had always been more of a training ground than a political alliance. Civilians, meanwhile, endured the last and perhaps most desperate phase of the war. Bombing raids against Republican-held towns in early 1939 inflicted casualties on populations already weakened by hunger and displacement. Refugees fleeing Catalonia flooded into France, creating humanitarian crises at border camps such as Argelès-sur-Mer, where conditions were harsh. Many of these civilians would later become victims of internment or deportation during the Second World War. Thus, the final operations of the Condor Legion not only shaped military doctrine, but also left lasting scars on civilian populations across the region. By March 1939, as Madrid prepared to surrender and the Republic fractured internally, the Condor Legion had accomplished its immediate mission. It had helped Franco achieve decisive victories, tested modern weapons and tactics, and accumulated a wealth of operational experience. Yet, its work in Spain was not without contradictions. While it demonstrated the effectiveness of air-ground cooperation, it also revealed the limits of aerial bombardment as a war-winning tool. For Germany, the final stage of the Legion's deployment offered both confidence and caution as Europe edged closer to a wider conflict. The stage was set for the Legion's withdrawal, but its impact would echo far beyond Spain. In the months that followed, the experiences of these campaigns would be transferred directly into the planning rooms of the Luftwaffe, influencing strategies that would soon engulf the whole of Europe. The final months of the Condor Legion's presence in Spain coincided with a decisive turning point in both the Spanish Civil War and the wider European political landscape. By the spring of 1939, the Republic was collapsing, its armies exhausted, its cities under siege, and its leadership fractured by internal disputes. For the Condor Legion, this period represented both a culmination of its military efforts and the moment when its broader significance became clear. Spain had been a testing ground, and the lessons drawn there were now to be applied on a continental scale. The collapse of Republican resistance unfolded rapidly after the Catalonia campaign. In March 1939, an internal coup in Madrid by Colonel Segismundo Casado split the Republican ranks, as moderates attempted to negotiate surrender to Franco rather than continue the war under communist influence. This political fracture eliminated what remained of organized defense. When Franco's final offensive began, the Condor Legion participated in limited but symbolically significant operations. German aircraft bombed retreating Republican units and communications networks, while reconnaissance flights confirmed the disintegration of resistance. By 28th March, Madrid had surrendered, and on 1st April, Franco officially declared the war over. For the Condor Legion, these events marked the conclusion of its combat role. Over the course of nearly 3 years, it had flown more than 3,000 sorties, dropped thousands of tons of bombs, and tested a wide range of aircraft and weapons. Its pilots had engaged in hundreds of aerial battles, refining techniques of dogfighting, ground attack, and tactical coordination. Losses were not insignificant. German records indicate around 300 killed, with many more wounded, but the strategic gains were considered far more valuable. The war in Spain had provided the Luftwaffe with live combat data that could not have been obtained through peacetime exercises alone. The turning point for the Legion, however, was not simply the end of the Spanish Civil War, but the transition from a covert intervention to an openly acknowledged foreign mission. Early in the conflict, Germany had sought to disguise its role, maintaining a veneer of non-intervention. By 1939, however, the Condor Legion's presence was widely recognized internationally. German officers wore their uniforms openly, and the Legion marched in Franco's victory parades. Berlin used the Legion as a propaganda tool, emphasizing its efficiency and discipline while downplaying the civilian casualties associated with bombing campaigns. The very visibility of the Legion at war's end marked a shift in Germany's posture, from cautious involvement in foreign conflicts to open preparation for its own. The Legion's experience also turned a corner in the field of doctrine. German commanders compiled extensive reports on air-ground coordination, the use of dive bombers, and the value of concentrated aerial offensives. These analyses emphasized the importance of combining fast-moving ground units with close air support, foreshadowing the Blitzkrieg campaigns of 1939 and 1941. The Finger 4 fighter formation, perfected in Spain, became standard Luftwaffe practice. Evaluations of aircraft types led to recommendations for mass production of models like the Bf-109 and Ju-87, while de-emphasizing less effective platforms such as the He-51 and Ju-52 in combat roles. For Franco and the nationalists, the turning point meant the consolidation of power. While Franco expressed gratitude for German assistance, he carefully avoided granting Berlin the economic or territorial concessions it had hoped for, such as access to Spanish mines or naval bases. This cautious stance preserved Spanish sovereignty and set the stage for Spain's neutrality in the Second World War. The Condor Legion's achievements had been indispensable, but Franco remained determined to avoid excessive German influence in domestic or foreign policy. For the Republican side, the final months were a period of despair and reckoning. Pilots and soldiers who had faced the Condor Legion for years acknowledged its effectiveness, particularly its dominance of the skies. Civilians, however, remembered the Legion primarily for the devastation it inflicted on cities and towns. Guernica, Bilbao, Barcelona, and countless others bore scars of bombardment. Refugees fleeing across the French border in early 1939 numbered in the hundreds of thousands, many later confined in makeshift camps where disease and malnutrition spread rapidly. For these survivors, the Condor Legion was not just a foreign force. It was a central factor in their displacement and suffering. Internationally, the turning point lay in perception. Guernica and Barcelona had already drawn global attention, but the conclusion of the war crystallized the image of the Condor Legion as a symbol of German militarism. In Britain and France, debates intensified over whether appeasement of Germany was viable, as the Legion's operations demonstrated the destructive power of modern warfare. In the Soviet Union, the experience hardened Stalin's conviction that Nazi Germany posed an imminent threat, influencing his eventual decision to seek a non-aggression pact. Thus, the actions of a few thousand German troops in Spain had disproportionate impact on European diplomacy. Within Germany itself, the Legion's veterans became an elite cadre in the Luftwaffe. Many of its commanders would later play leading roles in the campaigns of the Second World War. Wolfram von Richthofen, who had overseen many of the Legion's operations, emerged as a key figure in planning air campaigns in Poland and France. Pilots who had honed their skills against Soviet fighters in Spain would later face those same adversaries on a far larger scale. In this sense, the Condor Legion's turning point was not simply its withdrawal, but its transformation into a foundation stone of Germany's future military machine. The end of the Spanish Civil War thus marked a dual turning point, the culmination of the Legion's immediate mission and the beginning of its lasting legacy. It had demonstrated the possibilities and limitations of air power, altered the course of the Spanish conflict, and shaped the strategic outlook of Europe on the eve of global war. What remained was the question of how these lessons would be applied and at what cost, once the shadow of Spain gave way to the full darkness of the Second World War. With the conclusion of the Spanish Civil War in April 1939, the Condor Legion's active combat role came to an end. The period that followed was characterized by withdrawal, reflection, and the immediate consequences of its 3-year mission. The aftermath revealed both the scale of its influence on Spain's fate and the extent to which Germany had benefited from the intervention, while also exposing tensions, losses, and humanitarian crises that rippled across Europe. The withdrawal of the Condor Legion began in the spring of 1939. German personnel were gradually recalled, with equipment either returned to the Reich or handed over to Franco's forces. By May, most combat units had left Spanish soil. A ceremonial farewell was organized in Madrid and Burgos, where the Legion paraded before Franco and the nationalist leadership. The display was intended as both a demonstration of gratitude and an assertion of victory, cementing the partnership between Berlin and Madrid. For the German public, reports of the triumphant return emphasized discipline, efficiency, and the technical advances gained. The Luftwaffe presented the Legion's veterans as pioneers who had tested the future of warfare. However, the return also underscored the costs. Of the approximately 19,000 men who served in the Condor Legion over the course of the war, rotated in and out of Spain, around 300 were killed and nearly 500 wounded. Dozens of aircraft were lost, whether to combat, accidents, or mechanical failure. These losses were acknowledged but downplayed in official propaganda, overshadowed by the strategic lessons learned. Yet, for the families of the fallen and the veterans who had endured years of service abroad, the war left lasting personal scars. In Spain, the immediate consequences were stark. The Legion's withdrawal coincided with the consolidation of Franco's dictatorship. German aircraft and training programs were left behind to support the new regime, helping to modernize the Spanish Air Force. Yet Spain's population bore the weight of devastation, towns destroyed, industries disrupted, and thousands of civilians displaced. The legacy of the bombing campaigns, most notoriously Guernica and Barcelona, remained vivid in public memory. These experiences shaped Spanish attitudes toward foreign intervention and created long-lasting divisions between those who viewed the Legion as a decisive ally and those who saw it as a source of terror. Humanitarian crises followed in the wake of the war. Hundreds of thousands of refugees fled into France during the final offensives of 1939, overwhelming border regions unprepared for such numbers. Camps at Argelès-sur-Mer, Gurs, and other locations quickly became overcrowded with inadequate food, shelter, and medical care. Many of these refugees associated their displacement directly with the relentless bombing campaigns conducted by the Condor Legion and its allies. While German commanders considered such attacks militarily justified, their effects on civilians were profound and enduring. For the international community, the aftermath of the Condor Legion's operations sparked renewed debates about the ethics and legality of aerial bombardment. The League of Nations, already weakened by repeated failures, received appeals to prohibit indiscriminate bombing of civilian centers. Yet, with the world drifting toward wider war, these appeals remained largely symbolic. Britain and France, while publicly condemning German tactics in Spain, privately studied them. The Royal Air Force and the Armée de l'Air analyzed reports of Guernica and Barcelona, recognizing that their own cities might face similar attacks in the event of conflict. Thus, the Condor Legion not only shaped German doctrine, but influenced Allied preparations as well. Within Germany, the return of the Legion was celebrated as both a military and political success. Veterans were awarded medals, and units were honored in parades. The propaganda value was immense. Germany had intervened in a foreign war, supported an ideological ally, tested its latest equipment, and returned with prestige intact. Yet the Luftwaffe's high command was also keenly aware of the shortcomings revealed. Bombing alone had not secured victory, and logistical strains had limited operational tempo. Reports emphasized that air power was decisive only when integrated with fast-moving ground offensives, lessons that would be applied in Poland, France, and the Soviet Union. For the Republic's former soldiers and civilians, the aftermath was more grim. Many prisoners were executed or imprisoned by Franco's forces. Survivors who fled abroad faced uncertain futures. Some joined the French army. Others later became targets of Nazi occupation in France. The shadow of the Condor Legion hung heavily over their memories of defeat, as its dominance in the air had symbolized the technological imbalance that contributed to their downfall. The immediate aftermath also highlighted contradictions in German-Spanish relations. While Berlin expected to translate military support into political influence, Franco remained cautious. Spain did not join the Axis alliance and would remain officially neutral in the coming World War, despite ideological affinities. Franco's reluctance to bind Spain to Germany reflected both his desire to maintain sovereignty and the exhaustion of a nation shattered by civil war. Thus, the Condor Legion's victories in Spain did not produce the strategic alignment Berlin might have hoped for. Nevertheless, the operational and doctrinal outcomes of the Legion's mission were undeniable. Germany had tested its latest aircraft, refined bombing techniques, and trained a generation of pilots and commanders who would soon lead Luftwaffe squadrons across Europe. The aftermath of Spain was therefore both a conclusion and a beginning. The Condor Legion had completed its mission, but the lessons drawn from its actions were already shaping the future of global conflict. As the veterans returned home in 1939, the world was only months away from the outbreak of the Second World War. For those who had observed the Condor Legion's work, whether as participants, victims, or international observers, the aftermath of Spain stood as a warning. It had demonstrated the destructive potential of modern air power, the vulnerabilities of civilian populations, and the ways in which foreign interventions could alter the course of conflicts. The withdrawal of the Condor Legion closed one chapter, but it opened another that would unfold on an even greater and more devastating scale. The legacy of the Condor Legion is one of the most debated aspects of the Spanish Civil War, for it straddles the line between military innovation, political calculation, and the lasting trauma of civilians caught in its operations. In the years following its withdrawal in 1939, the Condor Legion was remembered in sharply different ways depending on perspective. For Germany, it was often hailed as a pioneering force that shaped the doctrines of the Luftwaffe. For Franco's Spain, it symbolized both the foreign aid that helped secure victory and the visible mark of foreign intervention. For the rest of the world, particularly in Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, it became a case study of the destructive power of modern air war, a harbinger of what was soon to come in the Second World War. Militarily, the Condor Legion's influence was profound. The tactical lessons derived from Spain shaped the Luftwaffe's doctrine of combined arms operations. Dive bombing, tested with early Junkers Ju-87s, became central to German strategy in the invasions of Poland and France. Fighter tactics such as the Finger Four formation, developed in the skies over Spain, were adopted universally in German air units. Reconnaissance methods, close air support coordination, and the strategic use of interdiction bombing were codified into operational manuals. Veterans of the Condor Legion, such as Wolfram von Richthofen, rose to senior positions, ensuring that the experiences of Spain directly informed decision-making during the global war that began in September 1939. At the same time, Spain also revealed limitations. The Legion's commanders observed that bombing alone could not achieve decisive victories against well-organized resistance. The protracted struggle at the Battle of the Ebro showed that determined ground forces could endure months of aerial bombardment if supply routes, morale, and defensive positions were maintained. Reports also highlighted logistical shortcomings, the difficulty of sustaining long campaigns, the wear on engines and airframes in harsh climates, and the strains of supply across foreign territory. These observations tempered some of the Luftwaffe's confidence, even as its successes were magnified in propaganda. Politically, the Legion left an ambiguous legacy. For Franco, German aid had been indispensable, yet he carefully distanced his regime from Berlin's expectations. Spain's neutrality in the Second World War demonstrated the limits of the alliance forged during the Civil War. Franco ensured that German military assistance did not translate into political dominance, and while Spain offered sympathy to the Axis, it withheld direct involvement. In this sense, the Condor Legion secured Franco's regime, but did not secure Germany a loyal ally. For civilians, the legacy was marked by suffering and memory. The bombing of Guernica in April 1937 became an enduring symbol of civilian vulnerability in modern warfare. Picasso's painting, displayed in Paris in the same year, gave the event international resonance, embedding it in collective memory as a warning against indiscriminate bombing. Other cities such as Barcelona, Bilbao, and smaller towns endured similar experiences, though they did not achieve the same global attention. Survivors and refugees remembered the Condor Legion not as a testing ground for doctrine, but as a source of fear, displacement, and destruction. The memory of these attacks shaped attitudes toward air war throughout the 20th century. Internationally, the Condor Legion's operations contributed to debates about the rules of war. The League of Nations condemned the bombing of civilians, yet no binding agreements were enforced. Britain and France, though critical of Germany's actions, studied them closely to prepare their own defenses. The Soviet Union, whose pilots had engaged the Legion in Spain, drew its own conclusions, accelerating aircraft development and reinforcing the Red Air Force in anticipation of a future clash. Thus, while the Legion's legacy was one of destruction, it also spurred rapid military modernization among all the major powers. Within Germany, the Legion was celebrated until the defeat of 1945. Its veterans were honored, its campaigns studied in military academies, and its experiences used to validate the Luftwaffe's doctrine. After the war, however, this legacy was reassessed. The devastation of Europe, the mass bombing of cities from Warsaw to Dresden, and the horrors of total war place the Condor Legion's experiments in a darker context. Historians and jurists debated whether its actions constituted a precursor to systematic terror bombing, or whether they remained primarily tactical experiments misinterpreted by later observers. In Spain, the memory of the Legion remained contested. Under Franco's dictatorship, its contribution was officially honored as part of the victory narrative. Monuments were erected, and commemorations were held. Yet, for those on the defeated Republican side, the Condor Legion symbolized foreign intervention and the crushing of democratic hopes. After Franco's death in 1975 and Spain's transition to democracy, public memory shifted. The bombing of Guernica, in particular, came to represent the suffering of civilians under dictatorship and foreign power. Commemoration became less about military victory and more about civilian endurance. In the wider world, the Condor Legion is remembered today as a case study in the transition from traditional warfare to the industrialized destruction of the 20th century. It foreshadowed the air campaigns of the Second World War, from the Blitz on London to the bombing of Stalingrad and beyond. It also serves as a reminder of how interventions in foreign conflicts can shape global strategy in unexpected ways. A few thousand German troops in Spain had influenced the tactics, politics, and morality of warfare across continents. The historical debate over the Condor Legion remains active. Was it primarily a training mission designed to test weapons and doctrines, or a decisive intervention that tipped the balance of the Spanish Civil War? Did it represent the birth of modern air power, or a warning of its destructive excesses? These questions continue to occupy historians, reflecting the complexity of its legacy. What is certain is that the Condor Legion left behind more than wrecked towns and defeated armies. It left a blueprint for air-ground cooperation, a set of doctrines that would dominate the opening years of the Second World War, and a moral legacy that continues to shape discussions about the conduct of war. Its story is inseparable from both the tragedy of Spain and the larger catastrophe that engulfed Europe only months after its return. Thus, the legacy of the Condor Legion is twofold: a military success that advanced German air power to the forefront of Europe, and a humanitarian disaster that demonstrated the vulnerability of civilians in modern war. Between those two poles lies its enduring significance, a symbol of innovation, intervention, and the human cost of experimenting with war in real time.